Jack had seen his fair share of chaos in his 30 years of farming, but nothing could have prepared him for this. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the air was filled with the hum of harvest season. Jack had just finished his coffee and was heading out to the fields when he noticed something strange. His John Deere tractor, a beast of a machine worth more than most people's houses, was gone. At first, he thought it might have been one of his farmhands moving it to another part of the property. But after checking with everyone, it became clear. The tractor had vanished. What made it worse was that this wasn't just any day. It was peak harvest season. Every hour without that tractor meant thousands of dollars in lost crops. Jack felt his blood pressure rise as he scanned the area for clues. That's when he saw them. Tire tracks leading off his land and toward the pristine suburban neighborhood that bordered his farm. His gut told him exactly who was behind this: Karen. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had been a thorn in Jack's side ever since she moved into her cookie-cutter McMansion 2 years ago. She'd complained about everything. The smell of manure, the sound of roosters crowing at dawn, even the sight of Jack's grain silos, which she once called an eyesore ruining our neighborhood aesthetic. But towing a tractor? That was a new low even for her. As Jack stormed back to his barn to figure out what to do next, he noticed something flapping in the wind on one of the doors. It was a piece of paper taped up haphazardly. He ripped it off and read it aloud. Notice of removal. Your equipment has been towed for violating HOA safety oversight regulations. Unsightly machinery is prohibited within visual range of our community. Jack couldn't believe what he was reading. HOA safety oversight? On my land? He muttered, crumpling the paper in his hand. His land wasn't even part of their HOA. It was state-leased farmland. Karen had no authority here, but clearly, that hadn't stopped her from overstepping her bounds. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the notice before dialing up one of his buddies at the county sheriff's office. As he waited for someone to pick up, Jack turned to the audience. Yes, you, with a wry smile on his face. You ever deal with someone like this? Someone who thinks they can just waltz into your life and make your problems their business? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. Jack hung up after leaving a message with the sheriff and headed back toward his house to make another call, this time to the state agricultural department. If Karen thought she could mess with him during harvest season, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. But before he could even dial, another truck pulled up his driveway. It was one of his farmhands, Billy, looking as flustered as Jack felt. Boss, Billy said, hopping out of the truck. I just heard from one of my buddies who works over by Maplewood Towing. They've got your tractor sitting in their lot. Jack's jaw clenched. Maplewood Towing was notorious for shady practices. Unlicensed drivers, exorbitant fees, and towing vehicles without proper authorization. If Karen had used them to tow his tractor, this situation was about to get even messier. All right, Jack said, grabbing his keys and heading for his truck. Let's go get my tractor back. As they drove toward Maplewood Towing, Jack couldn't help but think about all the times Karen had tried to meddle in his business before. She'd filed noise complaints about his farm equipment during planting season. She'd sent him letters demanding he beautify his property by planting decorative shrubs along the fence line. And now this, towing a tractor during harvest season? It wasn't just petty, it was personal. By the time they reached Maplewood Towing's lot, Jack was seething. He parked his truck and marched straight into the office, where a bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from her phone. I'm here for my tractor, Jack said firmly. The clerk raised an eyebrow. You mean that big green thing we hauled in this morning? Gonna cost you $1,500 to get it back. Jack leaned on the counter and locked eyes with her. You're holding state-leased equipment, he said slowly, enunciating each word like he was explaining something to a child. And if you don't release it right now, I'll have every legal authority from here to Washington breathing down your neck. The clerk blinked a few times before muttering something under her breath and disappearing into the back room. As Jack waited for her return, he couldn't help but smirk at how ridiculous this whole situation had become. Karen might have thought she could push him around like one of her HOA board members, but she had no idea who she was dealing with, or how far Jack was willing to go to set things right. this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jack stood in the middle of his field, staring at the empty patch of dirt where his tractor had been. The notice from Karen and her HOA was still crumpled in his fist. He couldn't believe it. Not only had she crossed a line, but she'd also sprinted over it with the audacity of someone who thought they were untouchable. Jack wasn't one to let things slide, especially not when it came to his livelihood. This wasn't just about a tractor, it was about principle. Karen had been a thorn in his side since the day she moved into her oversized house 2 years ago. Jack remembered that first encounter vividly. She'd marched up his driveway in her pastel cardigan and pearls, clipboard in hand, and introduced herself as the president of the newly formed HOA for the suburban development that bordered his farmland. She'd wasted no time explaining her vision for the neighborhood, which apparently included turning Jack's working farm into some kind of picturesque backdrop for her community's wine and cheese socials. At first, Jack had tried to be polite. He'd nodded along as she rattled off suggestions about planting wildflowers along his fence line and painting his barn a more aesthetically pleasing color. But when she started filing complaints with the county about the smell of manure and the sound of his equipment, Jack realized Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a problem. And now she'd gone too far. Jack spent the rest of that morning on the phone with anyone who would listen. The sheriff's office, the state agricultural department, even a lawyer he knew from church. The responses ranged from sympathetic to incredulous. But one thing was clear. Karen had no legal right to tow his tractor. The land wasn't part of her HOA's jurisdiction. It was leased to the state under an agricultural emergency preparedness program. That meant any interference with Jack's equipment was not only illegal, but could also carry serious consequences. By noon, Jack was ready to confront Karen directly. He drove over to her neighborhood, a maze of identical houses with perfectly manicured lawns and mailboxes that all looked like they'd been ordered from the same catalog. He spotted Karen almost immediately. She was standing in her driveway, chatting with another woman who looked equally smug. Jack pulled up and rolled down his window. "Karen," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to talk." Karen turned, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Oh, hello, Jack," she said, as if they were old friends catching up at a barbecue. "What brings you to our lovely neighborhood?" "You know damn well why I'm here," Jack said, stepping out of his truck. "Where's my tractor?" Karen crossed her arms and gave him a condescending smile. "I had it removed," she said matter-of-factly. "It was an eyesore and a safety hazard." Jack took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "That tractor is on state-leased farmland," he said slowly. "You had no right to touch it." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, please," she said. "Your land is within visual range of our community. And as HOA president, it's my responsibility to maintain property values." Jack stared at her in disbelief. "Property values?" he repeated. "This is farmland, Karen. It's not some gated community." Karen shrugged. "Rules are rules," she said smugly. Jack clenched his fists at his sides. He wanted nothing more than to tell Karen exactly what he thought of her and her so-called rules. But he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened an email from the state agricultural department. "Here's what you don't seem to understand," he said, holding up the screen for Karen to see. "This land is part of an emergency preparedness program for food production. That means any interference with my equipment is considered tampering with critical infrastructure." Karen's smug smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Well," she said stiffly, "I wasn't aware of that." "You should have been," Jack shot back. "And now you're going to have to deal with the consequences." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, another car pulled up behind Jack's truck. A black SUV with government plates. A man in a suit stepped out and walked over to them. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, looking at Jack. "That's me," Jack said. The man nodded and introduced himself as an inspector from the state agricultural department. He explained that they'd received Jack's complaint and were launching an investigation into the incident. Karen's face went pale as the inspector turned to her and asked for her side of the story. She stammered through an explanation about how she was just trying to protect her community from unsightly machinery. The inspector listened patiently before pulling out a clipboard and jotting down notes. When Karen finished speaking, he looked up at her and said calmly, "Mrs. Johnson, do you realize that tampering with equipment on state-leased farmland is a federal offense?" Karen blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. I didn't know," she said weakly. "Well," the inspector said, flipping through some papers on his clipboard, "ignorance of the law is not an excuse." Jack couldn't help but smirk as Karen struggled to come up with a response. The inspector spent another 20 minutes asking questions and taking notes before finally turning back to Jack. "We'll be following up with you soon," he said firmly before heading back to his SUV. As soon as he drove off, Karen turned on Jack like a cornered animal. "You didn't have to call them," she snapped. "We could have handled this privately." Jack raised an eyebrow at her. "You mean like how you privately decided to tow my tractor without telling me?" Karen glared at him but didn't say anything else. Jack got back into his truck and drove away feeling a mix of satisfaction and frustration. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But at least now Karen understood that she couldn't push him around without consequences. When he got home later that afternoon, there was already an email waiting for him from one of Karen's neighbors. A man named Tom who'd been quietly cheering Jack on since their first run-in with Karen 2 years ago. "Just heard what happened," Tom wrote. "About time someone put Karen in her place." Jack chuckled as he read the email before typing out a quick response. "This is just the beginning." Jack didn't have to wait long for Karen to make her next move. By the time he'd finished his second cup of coffee the next morning, he saw her walking up his driveway. She was dressed in her usual HOA uniform, a bright neon windbreaker, khaki pants, and sneakers that looked like they'd never touched dirt. In one hand, she held a clipboard. In the other, a folder stuffed with papers. Her face was set in a determined scowl, but Jack could see the cracks in her armor. She wasn't as confident as she wanted to appear. Jack stepped out onto his porch and crossed his arms. "Morning, Karen," he said flatly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Karen didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We need to discuss your conduct yesterday," she said, flipping through the papers in her folder. "I don't appreciate you calling state officials to my neighborhood. It caused quite a stir." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You mean the stir caused by you towing my tractor without permission?" Karen ignored him and continued. "I've reviewed our HOA guidelines," she said, holding up the clipboard like it was some kind of holy text. "And while your land isn't technically under our jurisdiction, your equipment is still visible from our community. That means it falls under our aesthetic oversight." Jack couldn't help but laugh. "Aesthetic oversight?" he repeated. "Karen, this is farmland. It's not supposed to look pretty." Karen bristled at his tone but pressed on. "Regardless," she said sharply, "I'm willing to offer you a compromise." Jack leaned against the railing of his porch and smirked. "Oh, this should be good." Karen straightened her posture and cleared her throat. "If you agree to relocate your equipment to the far side of your property, out of view from our neighborhood, I'll drop this matter entirely." Jack stared at her for a moment before shaking his head in disbelief. "You're unbelievable," he said. "You think you can just waltz onto my land and dictate how I run my farm?" Karen's face flushed with anger. "I'm trying to be reasonable," she snapped. "Reasonable," Jack shot back. "You had my tractor towed during harvest season. Do you have any idea how much damage that could have caused?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, another vehicle pulled into Jack's driveway, a black sedan with government plates. The state inspector stepped out of the car and walked toward them, clipboard in hand. He nodded at Jack before turning his attention to Karen. "Mrs. Johnson," he said calmly, "I'm here to follow up on yesterday's incident." Karen's demeanor shifted instantly. The arrogance melted away, replaced by nervousness as she clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. "I've already explained everything," she said quickly. "It was a misunderstanding." The inspector raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he flipped through the papers on his clipboard before speaking again. "We've reviewed the situation thoroughly," he said, glancing at Jack briefly before focusing on Karen again. And we've determined that your actions violated several state regulations. Karen's eyes widened. Violations? She echoed weakly. The inspector nodded. Tampering with equipment on state-leased farmland is a serious offense, he said firmly. Additionally, using an unlicensed towing company raises further legal concerns. Karen's face turned pale as she stammered out an explanation about how she was just trying to protect her community. The inspector listened patiently before cutting her off. Mrs. Johnson, he said, his tone firm but professional. Your intentions are irrelevant in this matter. The fact remains that you interfered with critical agricultural infrastructure during an active harvest. Jack watched as Karen struggled to come up with a response. For once, she seemed genuinely speechless. The inspector continued taking notes as Karen fumbled through excuses about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Your HOA guidelines have no bearing on state-leased farmland, he said bluntly, and any further interference will result in additional penalties. Karen looked like she wanted to argue but thought better of it. After another 20 minutes of questioning and note-taking, the inspector finally turned back to Jack. We'll be issuing formal citations shortly, he said firmly before heading back to his car. As soon as the inspector drove off, Karen turned on Jack with a look of pure fury. This is harassment, she snapped. You're trying to ruin me. Jack shook his head and laughed bitterly. No, Karen, he said calmly. You did that all by yourself. Karen glared at him for a moment longer before storming off down the driveway. Jack watched her go with a mix of satisfaction and frustration. He knew this wasn't over, not yet, but at least now Karen understood that there were consequences for crossing him. Later that afternoon, Jack received an email from one of Karen's neighbors, a man named Tom who'd been quietly cheering him on since their first run-in 2 years ago. Just heard what happened, Tom wrote simply. About time someone put Karen in her place. Jack didn't have to wait long for the fallout to begin. By the next morning, the state inspector's visit had already sent ripples through Karen's pristine suburban kingdom. Word spread quickly among the HOA board members, and Jack started receiving calls from neighbors he barely knew. People who lived in Karen's community but had grown tired of her antics. The first call came from Tom, one of the few people in the neighborhood who had always been friendly toward Jack. Hey Jack, Tom said, his voice low like he was sharing a secret. I heard about what happened with your tractor. You're not going to believe this, but Karen sent out an email to the entire HOA bragging about it. Jack leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone tightly. She what? He asked. Yeah, Tom replied. She called it a victory for neighborhood aesthetics. Said she was setting an example for how we should handle unsightly nuisances. Jack couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Unsightly nuisances? That tractor is worth more than her house. Tom chuckled on the other end of the line. I know, right? Anyway, I thought you should know. People are starting to turn on her. A few of us are even talking about calling a special meeting to vote her out as president. Jack thanked Tom for the information and hung up, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. Karen's arrogance was finally catching up with her. Later that afternoon, Jack received another call, this time from the state agricultural department. The inspector who had visited his property wanted to update him on their investigation. Mr. Thompson, the inspector began, we've reviewed additional evidence related to your case. It seems Mrs. Johnson used an unlicensed towing company to remove your tractor. Jack frowned. Unlicensed? What does that mean for her? Well, the inspector said, it complicates things for her legally. Not only did she interfere with state-leased equipment, but she also violated state regulations by hiring a company that wasn't authorized to tow heavy machinery. Jack nodded, even though the inspector couldn't see him. So what happens now? We're issuing formal citations to both Mrs. Johnson and the towing company, the inspector explained. Additionally, we're recommending that she be held liable for any damages or costs associated with retrieving your tractor. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. For once, it seemed like justice was on his side. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. The next day, Jack received yet another call, this time from one of Karen's own board members, a man named Bill who sounded both frustrated and embarrassed. Jack, Bill began hesitantly. I'm calling because Karen asked me to mediate on her behalf. Jack raised an eyebrow. Mediation? What does she want now? Well, Bill continued awkwardly. She's willing to cover the towing fees if you agree to drop the complaint with the state. Jack let out a bitter laugh. She wants me to drop it? After everything she's done. I know, Bill said quickly. I told her it was a long shot, but she insisted I ask. Jack shook his head in disbelief. Tell Karen I'm not interested in any deals, he said firmly. She made her bed. Now she can lie in it. Bill sighed heavily on the other end of the line. I figured you'd say that, he admitted. For what it's worth, most of us on the board think she's gone too far this time. After hanging up with Bill, Jack decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He remembered something important. His tractor had a dashcam installed. That evening, Jack retrieved the footage from his tractor's dashcam and watched as everything unfolded in crystal clear detail. The video showed Karen standing in front of the tractor with her clipboard, directing the tow truck driver like she was orchestrating some grand event. This will show him who runs this neighborhood, Karen said smugly as she posed for photos next to the tractor. Jack couldn't believe what he was seeing or hearing. He immediately forwarded the footage to both his lawyer and the state agricultural department. The next morning, Jack received an email from his lawyer confirming what he already suspected. Karen had just handed him all the evidence he needed to hold her accountable. Meanwhile, back in Karen's neighborhood, things were starting to unravel for her. The leaked email bragging about towing Jack's tractor had sparked outrage among many residents who were already fed up with her heavy-handed leadership style. She's gone too far this time, one resident wrote in an anonymous message posted on the community forum. I'm tired of her using our HOA dues for personal vendettas. Another chimed in. By midweek, several board members had resigned in protest, leaving Karen increasingly isolated. But Jack wasn't done yet. Armed with dashcam footage and legal backing from both his lawyer and the state agricultural department, Jack filed a formal complaint against Karen with local law enforcement. Within days, a sheriff arrived at her doorstep with a citation and a stern warning about interfering with critical agricultural infrastructure. Karen tried to play innocent at first, claiming she didn't know about state regulations or towing laws, but her excuses fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. As word spread about Karen's legal troubles, more neighbors came forward with stories of their own run-ins with her overreach. Fines for minor landscaping violations, threats of legal action over holiday decorations, even demands that residents repaint their homes to match her preferred color palette. By now, it was clear that Karen's reign as HOA president was crumbling, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication as he watched it all unfold. For years, he'd put up with her petty complaints and power trips, but this time was different. This time, Karen had underestimated just how far Jack was willing to go to protect his livelihood, and just how much support he had from those who were tired of living under her thumb. As Jack sat on his porch that evening watching another beautiful sunset over his fields, he couldn't help but smile at how things were finally starting to turn around. Not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been wronged by someone like Karen. Jack knew he had the upper hand, but he also knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. She'd already proven herself to be stubborn, entitled, and completely blind to her own mistakes. Still, Jack wasn't prepared for just how deep Karen's arrogance ran, or how much trouble she was about to bring on herself. It started with a phone call from Tom, the neighbor who had been keeping Jack informed about the growing unrest in Karen's HOA. Jack, Tom said, his voice tinged with urgency. You're not gonna believe this. Karen's doubling down. Jack frowned. What do you mean? She sent out another email to the entire HOA, Tom explained. She's claiming that you're trying to intimidate her and the board with legal threats. She's painting herself as the victim. Jack shook his head in disbelief. The victim? She's the one who had my tractor towed. I know, Tom said, sighing heavily. But she's spinning it like she was just doing her duty as HOA president. She even called you a disruptive influence on the community. Jack couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Disruptive influence? I've lived here longer than any of them. Tom chuckled dryly. Yeah, well, not everyone's buying it. A lot of people are fed up with her, especially after that email bragging about towing your tractor. Jack thanked Tom for the update and hung up, feeling both frustrated and amused. Karen was digging herself deeper into a hole, but she didn't seem to realize it. Later that afternoon, Jack received another call, this time from his lawyer. "Jack," the lawyer began, "I've been reviewing the dashcam footage you sent me, and it's even worse than we thought." Jack leaned forward in his chair. "How so?" "Well," the lawyer said, "not only does it show Karen orchestrating the tow and posing for photos, but it also captures her making several incriminating statements about your property and the state lease." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Incriminating how?" "She explicitly says she doesn't care about state regulations," the lawyer explained. "She even jokes about how rules don't apply to her as HOA president." Jack let out a low whistle. "That's bold." "It's reckless," the lawyer corrected him. "And it gives us plenty of ammunition if this goes to court." Jack nodded thoughtfully. He didn't want things to escalate that far if he could avoid it, but he wasn't afraid to take legal action if Karen kept pushing. Meanwhile, back in Karen's neighborhood, things were starting to unravel for her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The leaked emails and dashcam footage had sparked outrage among residents who were already fed up with her micromanaging and power trips. One neighbor posted anonymously on the community forum, "Karen has gone too far this time. Towing a farmer's tractor during harvest season? That's not leadership, it's insanity." Another chimed in, "I'm tired of paying HOA dues just so Karen can wage personal vendettas against hardworking people like Jack." By midweek, several board members had resigned in protest, leaving Karen increasingly isolated. But then came the real bombshell. One of Karen's own board members leaked more incriminating emails to the community. A series of messages where Karen admitted she'd used HOA funds to hire Maplewood Towing without consulting anyone else on the board. The fallout was immediate. Residents demanded an emergency meeting to address Karen's actions and decide whether she should remain as HOA president. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at the community clubhouse. Tom called Jack that morning to give him a heads up. "You should come," Tom said. "I know you're not part of the HOA, but this whole thing started because of what she did to you." Jack hesitated for a moment before agreeing. He wasn't one for public confrontations, but he wanted to see how this played out. That evening, Jack arrived at the clubhouse and found it packed with angry residents. People were whispering and gesturing toward Karen, who sat stiffly at the front of the room with her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. The meeting began with one of the remaining board members addressing the crowd. "We're here tonight to discuss recent events involving our HOA president," she said carefully, avoiding eye contact with Karen. Tom stood up next and summarized everything that had happened: the unauthorized towing of Jack's tractor, the misuse of HOA funds, and Karen's blatant disregard for state regulations. As Tom spoke, Jack couldn't help but notice how quiet Karen had become. For once, she wasn't interrupting or trying to take control of the conversation. When Tom finished speaking, several residents raised their hands to voice their frustrations. "This isn't what we signed up for when we moved here," one woman said angrily. "We wanted a peaceful community, not a dictatorship." "I agree," another man added. "Karen has abused her power for too long." Finally, Karen stood up and tried to defend herself. "I was only doing what I thought was best for our community," she said weakly. But her excuses fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence and overwhelming anger from her neighbors. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Karen had lost their trust and her position as HOA president. The board voted unanimously to remove her from office and appoint an interim president until new elections could be held. As Jack left the clubhouse that night, he felt a sense of closure, not just for himself but for everyone who had been wronged by Karen's arrogance over the years. It wasn't often that people like Karen faced real consequences for their actions, but this time was different. This time, justice had been served, and Jack couldn't help but feel like he'd played a small part in making it happen. Jack was just finishing up his morning chores when he saw two SUVs pull into his driveway. One had the familiar government plates of the state agricultural department, and the other was marked with the sheriff's office logo. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward them, feeling a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. It looked like things were finally coming to a head. The first person out of the state vehicle was the inspector Jack had already dealt with. A no-nonsense man named Harris who carried himself like he'd seen it all. From the sheriff's SUV stepped Deputy Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered man Jack had known for years. Miller gave Jack a nod as they approached. "Morning, Jack," Miller said. "We're here to wrap up this mess with your tractor." Jack motioned toward his porch. "You want some coffee before we get started?" Harris shook his head. "Appreciate it, but we've got work to do." Jack leaned against the railing as Harris opened a folder and pulled out several documents. "We've completed our investigation," Harris began. "And there's more to this situation than we initially thought." Jack raised an eyebrow. "More? How much worse can it get?" Harris handed him a copy of the report. "Karen Johnson not only violated state regulations by interfering with your equipment, but she also committed multiple infractions related to HOA governance. It turns out she used HOA funds without proper authorization to pay for the towing service, and that towing company wasn't even licensed to handle agricultural machinery." Jack let out a low whistle as he scanned the report. "So what happens now?" Miller stepped in. "We're here to serve her with formal charges," he said. "Tampering with state-leased equipment is a serious offense, and so is misusing HOA funds. She's looking at fines, restitution, and possibly more if this goes to court." Jack nodded slowly, feeling a sense of vindication. "Good," he said simply. Harris glanced toward Karen's neighborhood in the distance. "We'll be heading over there shortly," he said. "But before we do, we wanted to let you know that your tractor has been fully inspected and cleared for use. You can pick it up anytime." Jack felt a weight lift off his shoulders at those words. The tractor had been sitting in impound for days while the investigation played out, and every hour without it had cost him time and money during harvest season. "Thanks," Jack said sincerely. "I'll head over this afternoon." Harris gave him a curt nod before heading back to his vehicle, but Miller lingered for a moment longer. "You know," Miller said, lowering his voice slightly, "I've dealt with a lot of HOA disputes in my time, but this one takes the cake. Karen really thought she could get away with anything." Jack chuckled dryly. "She picked the wrong guy to mess with." Miller grinned and clapped him on the shoulder before heading back to his SUV. As Jack watched them drive off toward Karen's neighborhood, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure creeping in. It wasn't over yet. Not until Karen faced the consequences, but things were finally moving in the right direction. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to take a drive over to Maplewood Towing to retrieve his tractor. When he arrived, the lot manager greeted him sheepishly. "Mr. Thompson," the man said nervously, "we're real sorry about all this. We didn't know it was state-leased equipment when we got the call." Jack crossed his arms and gave him a hard look. "You didn't think to check?" The manager swallowed hard and shook his head. "We should've," he admitted. "It won't happen again." Jack didn't bother responding. He just wanted his tractor back so he could get back to work. The manager led him to where the tractor was parked at the far end of the lot. It looked none the worse for wear, but Jack still gave it a thorough inspection before climbing into the cab and starting it up. As he drove it out of the lot and back toward his farm, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that Karen's little stunt had backfired spectacularly. When he pulled into his driveway, one of his farmhands came running over. "Boss," Billy called out, "you're not gonna believe this. Karen's got cops at her house." Jack climbed down from the tractor and wiped his hands on his jeans again. "Cops?" he repeated. Billy nodded eagerly. "Yeah. One of her neighbors called me. Said they're serving her with charges or something." Jack couldn't help but smile at that. It seemed like karma was finally catching up with Karen. Later that evening, Tom called Jack again to give him an update on what had happened in Karen's neighborhood. "They served her with charges right on her front porch," Tom said, barely able to contain his glee. "Half the neighborhood came out to watch." Jack chuckled softly. "What did she do?" "She tried to argue with them," Tom said, laughing now. "Kept saying she didn't know about state regulations and that it was all just a misunderstanding." "And did they buy it?" Jack asked. "Not a chance," Tom replied. They handed her a citation and told her she'd be hearing from their lawyers soon. Jack shook his head in disbelief. Well, I guess that's what happens when you think you're above the law. Tom sighed contentedly on the other end of the line. You know, he said after a moment, it's nice to see someone like her finally get what they deserve. Jack couldn't agree more. As he hung up the phone and stepped out onto his porch to watch the sunset over his fields, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him. For years, Karen had been a thorn in his side, a constant source of frustration and unnecessary drama. But now she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. And while Jack knew there would always be people like Karen in the world, people who thought they could push others around without repercussions, he also knew that sometimes justice had a way of catching up with them in ways they never expected. This time, justice had come in the form of an old farmer who refused to back down, and Jack couldn't have been prouder of how it all turned out. Jack sat on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching the sun rise over his fields. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly tilled soil. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The chaos Karen had unleashed on his life was finally behind him, and he could focus on what really mattered: his farm, his work, and the simple joys of a quiet life. The fallout from Karen's actions had been swift and decisive. After being served with multiple citations and facing mounting legal troubles, she was forced to step down as HOA president. The news spread like wildfire through her neighborhood, and Jack couldn't help but chuckle at the irony of it all. Karen had spent years trying to control everyone around her, only to lose everything because she couldn't resist meddling in something that was none of her business. Tom called Jack a few days later to share the latest gossip from the neighborhood. "You're not going to believe this," Tom said, barely able to contain his laughter. "Karen's putting her house up for sale." Jack raised an eyebrow. "She's moving?" "Looks like it," Tom replied. "Word is she can't handle the embarrassment. Nobody wants anything to do with her anymore." Jack shook his head and chuckled. "Well, I can't say I'm surprised." Tom laughed along with him. "You know, Jack, I think you might have done us all a favor. This neighborhood's already feeling a lot less tense without her running things." Jack smiled at that. He hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to protect his livelihood. But it was nice to know that others had benefited from Karen's downfall too. A week later, Jack decided it was time to make a statement of his own. He drove into town and picked up some lumber and paint, then spent the afternoon building a sign to place at the edge of his property where it bordered Karen's former neighborhood. When he was finished, he stood back and admired his handiwork. A large wooden sign painted in bold letters that read "State Land, Stay Out." It wasn't just a message for Karen or anyone else who might think about crossing him. It was a reminder to himself that sometimes standing your ground was the only way to protect what mattered most. Over the next few weeks, life returned to normal for Jack. His tractor was back in action. The harvest was coming along nicely, and Karen's name gradually faded from conversation as people moved on with their lives. But every now and then, Jack would catch sight of someone from her old neighborhood driving by his farm and slowing down to read the sign at the edge of his property. It always brought a smile to his face. One afternoon, as Jack was working on repairing a fence line, Billy walked up with a grin on his face. "Boss," he said, "you're famous." Jack frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Billy held up his phone and showed Jack a video that someone had posted online. A compilation of clips from Karen's HOA meetings, her confrontation with Jack, and even footage of her being served with citations on her front porch. The video had been edited together with captions and dramatic music, turning Karen into an unwitting internet sensation. Jack watched in disbelief as the video played out. It ended with a shot of his wooden sign and the words, "Don't mess with farmers." "Well," Jack said after a moment, "I guess that's one way to get the message across." Billy laughed. "You should see the comments. People love you." Jack shook his head in amusement but didn't say anything more about it. He wasn't interested in fame or attention. He just wanted to get back to work. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching another beautiful sunset over his fields, Jack reflected on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. It had been exhausting and frustrating at times, but it had also reminded him of something important. No matter how much people like Karen tried to push others around, there were always ways to stand up for yourself, and sometimes even win. As he took another sip of coffee and listened to the distant sound of crickets chirping in the fields, Jack felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Life wasn't perfect, it never was, but it was good enough for him. And that was all he needed. Now folks, if you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed telling it, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or just love seeing justice served. And hey, leave me a comment below. Have you ever had someone like Karen try to mess with you? I'd love to hear your stories. Make sure you subscribe for more tales like this one. And don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and remember, don't mess with farmers.